PX836, it's episode 14, it's replay to be advised.
Hello and welcome again to the Valley's People. You know, the more people that we meet on this program, the more you discover things about the Hunter Valley. And today, do you realise that there was a town in the Hunter Valley that was sold, lock, stock and barrel, in 1920? And an historian of that town is going to tell us about it. And also in the Hunter Valley, we have the only autonomous commercial flying training school in Australia. We're going to meet the managing director of that school too. So I hope you can stay for today's episode of the Valley's People. Thanks for joining us today for the Valley's People. You know, Morpeth in 1920 was sold. Up till then it was a private town. An historian of Morpeth, a man who's gone right into this, is a farmer from Hinton, Harry Boyle, local historian, in fact a historian I guess of the whole lower Hunter Valley. But I'm intrigued by the sort of sleepy, hollow significance that Morpeth has now as compared to the sort of bustling community that it obviously was. And Harry, I hope you can tell us about it. But the first thing is this sale. How do you sell a town?
Well, it was a private town. It was on the Close's estate, and he split up it into allotments. And when the time came, of course he'd been dead a long time, but when the time came for the family to dispose of it, they put it up for sale, and that was the last connection that Close had with Morpeth.
Well, how did Close, that's Lieutenant Close, he was the original grantee, was he?
Yes, and in 1821 he was granted the area there, but it was reserved for him as early as 1818. And he was a member of the 48th Regiment, and of course he'd had influence. He was also the superintendent of works, so he had plenty of convicts, and I think by the time that Lieutenant Close would have taken over his property, it would have been practically cleared. And of course, there was a great argument in later years when Governor Darling wanted to build a town, the government town, at the head of navigation, but Lieutenant Close owned all this land, and there was a litigation between Close and Darling, and Close was willing to let the land go, but he wanted compensation. And Darling said that he'd used convicts to clear the land and he shouldn't have been compensated for it. So the upshot of it was that Maitland came into being as the government town and Morpeth remained a private town.
Yeah, he had some choice river frontage in those days, didn't he?
He had 7 miles of river frontage when the law stated that any one man can only own 1 mile of river frontage. So he must have had connections.
So you say that all the people, the sort of descendants of the town of Morpeth in the Hunter Valley, were originally on Lieutenant Close's property?
Yeah, Lieutenant Close would never sell a piece of land. He would if they built a brick home on it, he would lease it for 25 years, and then he would pay them the value of the home. But Close, he retained the ownership of the land.
And you mentioned there about Governor Darling. Was there a contest at the end of might?
Yes, well, yes. Governor Darling and Close didn't get on together. Close was a magistrate. An Aboriginal was taken out of a jail at Stockade Hill, East Maitland, and taken down the gully behind the jail and shot, which really wasn't British justice. And Lieutenant Close was the magistrate, and he evidently condoned the action. But Governor Darling stated that it was wrong, and Close had to resign from the magistrate's office over this. But the people all stuck to him. He was the father of Morpeth, as you really understand, and later he became an MLC. So evidently the condoning of the shooting of the Aboriginal didn't affect his career at all.
And there great lot of stories about early Morpeth. I mean, I think the thing that sticks in my mind most when reading about it was the fact that the claim that was made that at a certain stage of Morpeth's early career, it was in fact a busier port than anywhere else in New South Wales. It was a busier port than Sydney. Has your research confirmed
Yeah,
that?
well, like everybody today, when they walk into a sleepy little town of Morpeth where it's, you know, you see a lovely, ideal, quiet little spot to get away from the rat race, cannot realise that once it was a bawdy, rowdy, boisterous port where sailors from all over the world roisted there, it was the inland port for all the northern New South Wales and the north of the Liverpool Range and up as far as the south of Queensland. I've got here just 1 week's. Would you like to hear this?
Weeks what?
1 week's cargoes that left.
Oh, yeah, really?
Well, in the last week in September 1857, when that was the year the railway started from Newcastle to Maitland, and I picked that week because it would have been actually the start of the decline of the port of Morpeth. There was 27 vessels inwards and 20 outwards. And the cargoes for the week were, outward cargoes for the week were 79 tonnes of wool, 124 tonnes of hay, 224 hides, 2,027 bushels of wheat, 4 tonnes of flour, 1.5 tonnes of bran, 70 tonnes of wheat and 303 tonnes of coal, plus sundries. And the sundries were single items like horses, cows, coops of fowls, pigs, parcels and what have you.
What do you say, there are 27 vessels in?
27 vessels in. They'd be bringing in all the provisions for the northern New South Wales.
Because when you talk about Morpeth now, and sort of the vessel constitutes a rowing boat up the river at that stage, they must have been much bigger than that.
This is what people don't realise, and it was a very, very boisterous town.
Main Street busy?
The main street on the shopping night, it was all shopping night in those days. If you didn't get into town before 6 o'clock, you couldn't get a hitching rail along the main street.
Really?
You had to take your horse and vehicle up to one of the back streets, and that wasn't liked because you most likely come to get it when you go home and it'd have no horsehair left on it because it was a saleable commodity and all the youths and that of the town would readily take it. So everybody tried to get into town before 6 o'clock. The sidewalks was that crowded that the troopers would march up and down the middle of the street to keep order. There'd be no room for them to walk up and down on the footpaths.
You're having me on a bit.
No, that is true.
Really?
Yes, and that was from an eyewitness that I actually spoke to before he died. When I was a young fellow, I used to talk to him every night, and that was his account of Morpeth in them days, and especially the shopping night.
The thing that's fascinating there now, Harry, is the fact that it's still one of the only towns in the Hunter Valley, if not the only one, I guess, that's still got cobblestone streets around.
Yes, the cobblestones are still there. Actually, there is now a great controversy. The Municipal Council of Maitland is trying to cover these cobblestones with bitumen or concrete, and at one stage, one of the women that owned the property stood the council workmen off with a broom and refused to allow them to do that. But of course, you can see the council's point of view that they say that the people shouldn't have to put up with second-rate amenities,
Well, you might see it, I can't. I think heritage is important.
I can't either. I think, well, as a tourist attraction alone, it's worth its weight in gold.
Yeah, of course. Because the landmark there at the moment is that beautiful St James Church at Morpeth.
Yeah, well, St James is Morpeth, really. It's everybody that comes to Morpeth, the tourist, is one of the first spots that they go to, and it has a long history. It was built as a vow by Lieutenant Close in one of the Peninsular War battles, the Battle of Albuera, I think it was. They ran forward to save the colours, three officers and a sergeant. And a shell burst overhead. They all hit the ground. Lieutenant Close's head was between the legs of the sergeant, and only one stood up. The others were blown to pieces. And he said if he was saved through the battle, when he came out, he would build a church in God's honour. And when he had got the grant at Morpeth, he built St James's.
Well, he might have shot an Aborigine, but he was true to his vow anyway.
He was a marvellous man. He was. There was one contemporary said of him, he may not have been a highly educated man, but he was courageous and he stuck to his his word, and he was a great man. He was known as the father of Morpeth.
I wonder what Morpeth was like the day that the horse, 1913 wasn't it, won the Melbourne Cup?
Posinatus.
Posinatus, yeah.
Yeah, well, that was a fluke that Posinatus was even in the Melbourne Cup field. A punter had taken the double on the Caulfield Cup and the Melbourne Cup. He had Orifor in the Caulfield Cup and Posinatus in the Melbourne Cup. Well, Orifor won, and this punter stood to win a fortune. So at the time, Posinatus had accepted for the Cup, but they were not certain whether they wanted to start him or not. And this punter came all the way up from down the south to see Jim Chambers, and the upshot of the meeting was that whether he paid the expenses, I don't know what it was, but whether he paid, well, the upshot of it was that Posinatus went to Melbourne to run in the Melbourne Cup, and after the first furlong he went to the front, and they never headed him. He was still in front when they went past the winning post. And there's a remarkable story about Posinatus. He was bred up at the north of New South Wales around Tenterfield, and when he finished his racing he went back there, and as a gelding of course he was no good for breeding, and it was given to the parish priest there to ride round on his rounds. And one day he was riding around and 3 young lads who didn't evidently know him said, "That's a sorry nag, father, you're riding." And he said, "Yes, it may be," but he said he's not too bad. And the young bloke said, "Well, how about a race?" And he said, "I'll race you." He said, "But if I win, you've got to come to church on Sunday morning." Of course, they lined up, and the way they went, and the further they went, the further Posinatus went away. So the 3 young lads had to go to church on Sunday morning.
That's probably the only Melbourne Cup winner that's ever been used sort of in that sense.
I think it could be.
Yes. Someone told me, Harry, that you've been collecting items about Morpeth and the Lower Hunter Valley pretty well all your life, and that quite tragically, really, most of this was swept away in the 1955 flood. Is that right?
That's true, yeah. Nearly all of it, in fact.
In fact, someone said the only vision of Harry Boyle that I can find is the fact that he was camped on top of a haystack for 2 days with his wife.
Yes.
You can laugh about it now, I guess.
I had snakes and even a cow trying to get onto the stack with us, you can. It's something to talk about now, but it was a real serious occurrence when it was in progress.
Yeah, and it's a shame a lot of that is gone now for historical purposes.
Well,
but
actually,
you're putting it all
a lot of it was original material, you know, would be unobtainable again.
And in your spare time now, you just go around collecting and looking for old graves.
Yes, yes, we do that, and we found some good ones too.
All parts of the valley?
Yes, anywhere. If somebody comes and tells us they've discovered a grave in the bush, we'll go and photograph it and record it. And we call it a way off the beaten track, like the Leyland brothers, you know. And it's amazing the number of people in the early days who were not buried were buried where they died and on properties and things like that. And a lot of the actual pioneers of our country were buried in that manner.
It's also amazing, Harry, to learn these things about Morpeth, and I'd like to thank you very much in coming in today in the Valley's People. Harry Boyle, historian of Morpeth, and in fact most things of the Hunter Valley. I'll be back in just a moment with today's second guest in the Valley's People. Welcome back to the Valley's People. You've probably seen round in the valley NASA, N-A-S-A, which is not really a branch of Houston, Texas, or some other part of the United States. It stands for the Nationwide Aviation Space Academy, which is very much part of the Hunter Valley. And in fact, NASA produces more commercial pilots than any other organisation in Australia. And we have the Managing Director of NASA with us now, Jim Spark. Welcome to the Valley's People. Boy, Nationwide Space Aviation Academy. Were you trading on a name, or was that something original?
No, it was original. It was more or less given to us by a particular person in the aviation industry who I wouldn't be game to mention, but he said that would be a pretty good name, and we thought it would be, so we stuck to it.
Yes, well, you've certainly brought some people to the Hunter Valley in this enterprise, haven't you? Because if I can just get things right and in perspective, you're actually training at Cessnock commercial pilots. It's people who fly aircraft for a living, am I right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and we've trained pilots from many countries. We've trained about 150 for Garuda Indonesian Airways, about 25 from the Malaysian airline system. I think there were about 18 Papua New Guineans, and we've had a few odd bods. We've got a couple from Air Pacific, which is Fiji. So
Yes.
we don't only train Australian people, we've been training overseas people.
Yeah, well, that's a great credit to the Hunter Valley. I'm pleased about that, Jim, in that sense. But if someone just came to you and just wanted to learn to fly just for the fun of it, you're not into that at all, are you? You send him away somewhere else.
Yes, we only teach the professional. We're not there to teach the weekend pilot or the person who wants to do it for fun. We're there to teach the person who wants to do it for a living.
Mm-hmm. And can anyone really do that? Can anyone go through to become aircrew, in your opinion? What kind of person is it that can fly our aircraft around?
Well, I think you're looking for three fundamental units for every person who takes up professional flying. The first thing, they'd have to have some academic ability, naturally enough. Secondly, they'd have to have the manipulative skill to be able to pole the aeroplane, as we call it, or to actually manoeuvre it. And the third thing is the ability to operate it, and that's really the crunch factor, this ability to operate the aeroplane, which is we want the person who's able to work under a reasonable amount of stress and not lose his cool, and be able to still work out all the problems that he's got to come to terms with in flying the aeroplane. It's operating the aeroplane is where most people would fall down, not in actually learning to fly it or why it flies. That's not all that difficult. But that operating the aeroplane does have some problems.
Well, how do you sift this out of a group of people then, Jim? How can you sort out that he or she will be suitable temperamentally and other reasons to fly people, say 300 or 400 people around at a time?
Well, we firstly have to have a look at their academic background, and we generally test them for academic IQ, if you like. Then we put them through our own personality profile test to see what personality they should have on paper, and then of course you've got to interview the person to see that in fact they have the right sort of background, because one tends to, with personality, do those things that your personality suits. For that reason, the ideal type that we would be looking for would be the known achiever. He probably would have done reasonably well at school, gone through to probably HSC, but not necessarily. He may have been a scout and followed the scouting movement through, possibly even become a Queen Scout. He could have accessed the Duke of Edinburgh Award scheme. He's probably got a good sporting history. In other words, he's a real goer.
You're looking
Bit
for
of
a leader
liver.
somewhere there, yeah.
Oh, yeah, without doubt. We've got to
Yeah.
have a leader.
Yes. Yeah, I'm not quite sure whether you'd be talking about himself or herself. Have you got any feelings about the future and girls making this profession?
Not really. I think that girls have a problem in making this profession. Not that they can't do it. That would be wrong. They can do it. The difficulty I think we have to face, particularly with young ladies, is whether they're going to choose this as a career or whether they want to take up motherhood, because I see a difficulty in our society at the moment anyway, in whether girls can retain the recency factor that is demanded, particularly for airline flying. In the lower echelon of aviation, I don't see a big problem. In fact, I think girls are more suited to some aspects of aviation than our male counterparts.
Why do you say that? And in what areas are you talking about?
Well, particularly in flight instruction, I think they've got more patience and more tolerance, and are more likely to pursue that as a career rather than a young lad who wants to get into the airline is using it as a stepping stone to gain experience. And this is a major problem to the industry, of course. We can't retain instructors because it's a stepping stone through. When we talk of the young lady, of course, we have the problem of this 30 or 35-day recency, which is a requirement of the airline. You've got to have one night landing in 30 days if you want to be able to fly by night. You've got to have used the instrument landing system once in 35 days, otherwise you fall out of recency. And you imagine every time you fall out of recency, you've got to pull an aeroplane off the line and drive it round the circuit with two people up front just to get back in recency. It's not a very economical exercise.
So you can't bow out for a period of time, sort of come back like a nursing career or something?
You can, but there's a lot of training goes into recapping where you were when you bowed out.
Because we're looking at it, I guess, from an Australian point of view. Now, you mentioned that you had students from New Guinea and Garuda. Let's just take New Guinea by way of example. Now, they're coming from a totally different background, and what are their experiences and how does it relate to jet flying?
Boy, their experiences when they come to us, of course, are very limited. And the first piece of mechanical equipment that the lad gets his hands on in life is not a scooter or a three-wheel push bike, it's an aeroplane. And the difficulty he has is he has no basis of relationship to mechanical things and things that move. He's just got no affinity with mechanical things. Consequently, he's starting a long way behind the 8 ball. He's got to learn that there's such a thing as speed and power and how to apply it. A bit different from our Australian kids who have possibly got a motorbike at the age of 8 years of age and blazing around a trail track out in the country. So they have a lot of problems. A demonstration of that problem, we had a particular lad who we were trying to teach to land the aeroplane, and he was in a bit of a crosswind. So he'd lined up the aeroplane on the strip, which was fine, and the wind was blowing him across. And he didn't take any corrective action to lay off the drift. He just simply kept his eye on the runway, and of course the aeroplane was going over here, landing among the grapevines, but he was still watching the runway out to the left. And of course he didn't recognise exactly what was happening to the aeroplane because they don't have any background, nothing to relate it to.
Boy, oh boy, and you work upon that problem, or do you just give up?
Oh no, you work upon that problem, right. And they're quite able to cope once they see the problem and it gets stuck in their brain box.
I remember a long time ago, and I guess it is a long time ago too, I used to work at 2HR Maitland, which is not even there now. I think I helped cool it. But there was a program, we were doing some research for a program of the District Park Aero Club, when in fact they had tiger moths and so on down right slap bang in the middle of Newcastle. And I remember going through the old heralds and we saw people protesting about the airstrip because low-flying aircraft would cut off people's heads and all these other things that sort of sound ridiculous now. But when you came into Cessnock with this idea of establishing, shall we say, commercial pilots and becoming the centre basically for whole of Australia, did you have any local resentment or things of this nature?
No, certainly no resentment. We did have a lot of people come out to see what was going on, and that in 1967, when we first started, the entrance to the airport was halfway down the runway and used to cut straight across it. And of course people coming out in their cars used to have to cross the runway, and we had one particular load of young ladies came out to see what was going on, and they hesitated, and to get a better view of the aeroplane they kept creeping out onto the runway. And the particular instructor landing the aeroplane had to virtually tilt his wing to get over the top of the motor car. It wasn't very funny, but they were quite happy about it.
But that's sort of like training for an emergency situation in a very practical way, isn't it?
My word.
And you do, I mean, our idea of a sort of captain is just a man sitting up front, but how long does it take after someone or graduates from your school before he can actually get command of his own aircraft? In an airline system? In an
airline system, it takes quite a while. Usually, from graduation, a fellow is required to work at least, say, 2 to 3 years in the industry to gather basic experience. There he's flying in command of a small aircraft. Once he joins the airline, if he joins the domestic, he would be a first officer, and he would be a first officer for, in ANSET, around about 10 years, in TIA because of the system a little longer, maybe 12 or 14 years before he gains a command. But in Qantas he joins as a second officer, and he does not really fly the aeroplane at all for a good 5 years, maybe a little longer. He's just sitting there to develop gain experience of all the different things that he has to come to terms with, apart from this enormous aeroplane that weighs something like 400 tonnes. Those people have got to learn to operate in and out of various parts of the world where the weather service is totally unreliable. In a lot of cases they have to go at certain heights across wars that are happening, such as Vietnam or Korea. And it's amazing that the things that these people have to learn to cope with. This customs, fuel, It's not uncommon, you read in the newspaper, where they land at some particular port a little bit offbeat, and of course you're held up by people at gunpoint. And all these things you can only learn by experience and somebody passing on the word to you, because you couldn't write a book about it. The book would be too big to read.
Yeah, so he just sits there for 5 years plus to just become familiar with the world, really, isn't it?
He's becoming familiar with the operation of the aeroplane as it is required in the international scene, and at the same time he's undergoing a lot of training in jet aircraft, but that's a small jet that Qantas use for their training, a HS-125, and that is a fairly hot little ship that he's learning to fly. He does a lot of flying in that, but it's all under training.
So why did you pick Cessnock, Jim, for this centre?
The reason we came to Cessnock, which we had two places, we were going to go to Moruya, and that was nearly on, and then someone said, what about Cessnock? But it was a pretty cut-up sort of a runway in those days, and there wasn't much activity off it. But the reason we finished up at Cessnock was mainly because of the radio navigation aid complex in the Lower Hunter, which is fantastic, and we use it a tremendous amount in training.
Well, I guess we can all be very pleased that you did that. Jim Spark, Managing Director of NASA from Cessnock, thank you very much for taking part in the Valley's People. I'll be back in just a moment in today's program. Well, some fascinating moments about early Morpeth in our program today from Harry Boyle, a farmer of Hinton, who's been checking on the past of Morpeth and other parts in the Hunter Valley. And also Jim Spark, Managing Director of the nationwide Aviation Space Academy, which is now settled in Cessnock and turning out more pilots than anywhere else in Australia. I hope you can join us again in the next program of the Valley's People. See you then. Goodbye for now.